Okay, so good afternoon. First off, I would just like to very much thank the Pain Talks organizers for allowing me to be here today. And as you can see, the talk, I have titled my talk today, From Venom to Virtual Reality, a look at some surprising pain therapies. Now before I really jump in, I just want to take a moment to explain where I'm coming from and what led me to talk about this with you today. So I am a master's student in Professor Philippe Sarret's lab, and in the Sarret lab we do fundamental research. So we work at the very early stages of trying to develop new medication for chronic pain, and I personally work mostly with cell cultures, really trying to decipher the signaling of one receptor in particular. And I love fundamental research. What draws me to science, and what has really always drawn me to science, is the idea of discovery, of being able to understand just a little bit more about how we function at a cellular and at a molecular level. And I personally absolutely love the idea that I could literally devote my entire life to studying one small system. And yet, because our physiology is so amazingly intricate and complex, I could get to the end of my life and still really not be able to fully characterize it or fully grasp it in all of its complexity. But, as much as I love fundamental research, whenever I attend pain conferences, I'm always very keenly aware of the fact that what I do is so very far removed from the actual patient. I don't deal with sick people. I barely deal with healthy people. I don't deal with rats or mice. So I thought this would be a really good opportunity for me to take a step closer to the patient and to ask myself, when conventional methods aren't working, when pharmacological approaches are no longer enough, what else is there? What other therapies are available to the patient that I don't know about? And amazingly, these include Venom and virtual reality. So these are the two that really stuck with me, and I want to just briefly highlight for you today. So I'd like to start with a quote from a very sappy teen novel, where Augustus turns to the main protagonist and says, very dramatically, "That's the thing about pain. It demands to be felt." Now what I think this illustrates quite nicely is the fact that pain is insistent. It demands to be felt, and it demands to be attended to. Now if you're anything like me, you might like to pretend that you're strong and tough and that nothing can hurt you, right up to the moment when you stub your toe against a door frame, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, and nothing else matters. And in that moment you would do just about anything to make that pain go away. And I believe, and I think we've seen it a little bit today, that there can be a very desperate quality to patients who suffer with chronic pain, or to those who have loved ones who suffer with chronic pain, where they get to the point that they would try just about any treatment to make their pain go away. And there are a lot of strange, unusual treatments that are out there, some of which we've heard of today, some of which you may be familiar with. For example, electrical stimulation, TENS, or deep brain stimulation, which, no offense, Matson, I really want to stay far away from. Another one, which I never heard of before, is called prolotherapy. So they use sugar. This is really for osteoarthritic patients, so patients who have very painful arthritic joints. One treatment, one method, is to actually inject high dextrose solutions right into the joint, and this can apparently help relieve pain. Prolotherapy's cousin, platelet-rich plasma therapy, is the same basic concept. Osteoarthritic patients, very painful joints, but in this case they use the patient's own blood. Other ones you've heard of, hypnosis, mindful meditation, we heard of today. But the two which really stuck with me, and that I wanted to explore a little further, were Venom therapy and the use of virtual reality. So let's start with Venom therapy. This is a therapy that literally uses Venom as a means to treat pain, and not just pain, actually a whole variety of disorders. It's a very ancient practice. It dates all the way back to ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient China, and is still widely practiced in Asia and to some degree in North America. And one of the interesting things about VVT is that there are whole societies and groups that are very, very avid proponents of Venom therapy. People who will swear that this is the treatment that really changed their lives and took away their pain. And one such association is the American Apitherapy Association. So this is a group which believes very strongly not just in Venom per se, but but really any treatment having to do with bees, the beehive, or honey. And I couldn't resist sharing this quote from their website, which I find kind of funny, where they talk about being an organization that reaches beyond traditional Western medicine in order to help their patients attain better health through a holistic approach in harmony with the beehive, a true gift of nature. Now, okay, I find this funny, but the fact is that this is a therapy that has been around for hundreds of years, is supported by case studies, testimonials, and some scientific evidence. So the next logical question for me was, okay, bee venom. Now what's the mode of administration? And there are a few different ways. In a lab setting, in a research setting, it tends to be straight up subcutaneous injection. Another very common mode of administration is something called acupuncture. So it's basically acupuncture, but with acupuncture needles that are dipped in dilute bee venom. But really, the easiest way, if you want to shoot yourself up with bee venom, is simply to get stung, which means that as long as you are either A, a beekeeper yourself, or B, have some kind of tight-knit relationship with a beekeeper who can provide you with a steady swarm of bees, you can self-treat. And there are people who do this, who treat themselves with bee venom without much clinical supervision. I actually read this online testimonial of a woman who described going to a bee stinging club. So it was a group of about 20 women who would meet 3 to 4 times a week and just sit around in a circle and over cookies and coffee, just wait to get stung each in turn, and sort of living in dread fear of the moment that a bee would actually get loose and sting the hostess, who wasn't part of the treatment. And the women would initially experience some local pain and inflammation, but over time, with an increasing number of bee stings, they would see their pain go away. And this leads me to a very interesting paradox which exists in the science having to do with bee venom. Because if you're sitting here and you're thinking, okay, wait, doesn't bee venom hurt? Well, yes it does. And there are numerous studies that really document the pro-nociceptive and the pro-inflammatory properties of bee venom. These are clinical studies, animal studies, studies that have broken down bee venom into its different constituents, such as melatonin. So melatonin is a polypeptide which forms about 40 to 60% of bee venom. It has been tested alone, and it itself is mostly pro-nociceptive in most studies. And yet, and the actual mechanisms by which bee venom induces pain are fairly well known. It's known that it acts on quite a variety of different receptors and channels. And yet, on the flip side, there are also studies which show anti-inflammatory and anti-nociceptive properties of bee venom. Now, on the whole, there tend to be less of these. The clinical studies themselves can be kind of problematic because they tend to be mostly case studies or clinical studies with quite small sample sizes. But the animal studies are really quite hard to refute because there are a lot of them, and they use pain models that we all know and use. And in those models, they will often document an initial pain or inflammation, which is localized, but they will see pain relief in a secondary, larger pain model, such as neuropathic pain or inflammatory pain. And it's believed that this would be due to the descending inhibitory system, and so involve a serotonergic or adrenergic system. And that in this case, the bee venom might act really as a counter-irritant, so it's sort of introducing a second nociceptive stimulus that would relieve pain in a larger framework. And I think this paradox concerning the research with bee venom is probably one of the reasons why it's not a mainstream therapy. Another reason is the whole question of allergies. So allergic reactions to bee stings are very common in North America, and for these patients, this could actually be a very dangerous approach. And then I'm sure they're just people who object to being stung by bees. So this is really all I want to say about this therapy, just to keep in mind that it's a practice that's been around for hundreds of years, is supported to some extent by testimonials, case studies, and scientific evidence, and yet there's still some very legitimate concerns, I think, in going forward with this therapy. Now, the second therapy I want to discuss today is not an ancient practice, but a much more futuristic one, and it caught my eye because it sounded to me like pure science fiction. And this is the use of virtual reality in order to relieve pain. Now, there are a few different groups who use this, who study this. I want to focus a little more on an approach used by two researchers from the University of Washington in Seattle. So this is David Patterson and Hunter Hoffman. And they were, to my knowledge, really the first to develop a VR program specifically designed to treat pain. So in their clinic, they received a lot of soldiers coming back from Iraq or children from the pediatric unit who had very severe burns. And during their stay at their hospital, it would be their job to treat their pain, which could be very intense. And they realized that while generally pharmacological approaches could control the pain, during specific moments like wound cleaning or during physical therapy, the pain was just too intense and pharmacological approaches no longer were effective. So what they decided to do was to provide an immersive virtual reality experience for their patients so that during wound cleaning, during physical therapy, they could hook their patients up with these wide view virtual reality goggles, give them a mobile mouse, or in some cases use eye tracking, and then just immerse them in the virtual reality world called Snow World. Now, Snow World is basically a first-person shooter game set in a magical land of ice and snow, where the patient is shooting out snowballs at snowmen, penguins, flying fish, woolly mammoths, and it's all set to this kind of happy Steven Tyler music. And the idea is that it has to be as attention-grabbing as possible and takes the severe burn patient as far away from his reality. And amazingly, patients actually do report that using virtual reality, they feel less pain, and that is actually kind of fun. So the kind of theory behind why this would work is basically that the virtual reality acts as an elaborate distraction. So I think you're all quite familiar now with what has basically become an adage in pain research, that pain is in the brain. Which is why now all the early events in pain perception, such as the painful stimulus, activation of the receptors, action potential shooting its way up to the spinal cord, are all events that we refer to as nociception. And we only speak of pain once the signal reaches the brain and can then be integrated and interpreted by the brain. Now the idea is that our brain really only has a finite amount of attention that it can devote to painful processing. So if you put the patient in a situation which is just as attention-grabbing as possible, it will keep him from being able to fully process his pain. And this is supported to some extent by functional MRI studies. Now there are a few interesting things about this therapy, one being that while 15 years ago all this equipment would have been very expensive, technology has advanced to such a degree that you can actually buy these Oculus Rift virtual goggles, which are quite inexpensive. It's also a therapy which has virtually no side effects. They watch out for nausea or dizziness, but very few patients ever report any. And yes, it might not be a treatment that you would recommend 24/7. I don't think anyone wants this to become, Tron or the Matrix. But during specific moments, very specific times, it can be quite effective. So these are really just the two therapies I wanted to briefly highlight for you today. And my goal was really not to convince you of the validity or the non-validity of either treatment. I'm not suggesting that the next thing we should all do is get stung by bees and walk around an imaginary world. What I just wanted to do today was to say, hey, these are therapies which you might not be aware of and which do exist. And that I think as part of a larger community of pain researchers, we really owe it to patients to seriously explore and assess the validity of these alternative treatments and others so that patients can find pain relief in a way that is safe and responsible. So thank you very much.